Okay, last week, I'm sucking on a throat lozenge. I'm still not quite over whatever it is I've got. Last week we finished up 2 Kings, which essentially is the end of an era for the Jews. The northern kingdom had gone away 100 and some odd years earlier. The southern kingdom in Judah hung on for another 100 or so years, 120 years or so, and then they were carried off in a series of carryings off over a period of 40 or 50 years into Babylonian captivity. The northern kingdom had gone into Assyrian captivity, and eventually Assyria was absorbed into the Babylonian empire, but we never really hear what happened to the Jews that went into Assyria. One would presume that they continued there and were absorbed into society, into Babylonian society after that was taken over. But the story at the end of 2 Kings kind of continues through into Jeremiah a little bit. He does an awful lot of 2 Kings, but he predicts a 70-year exile in the Babylonian kingdom, or Babylonian Empire. And at the same time, we have some other books that pop in that actually discuss some of the things that went on in the Babylonian Empire. So it makes sense for us to perhaps take a quick glance at them too. And those books are the books of Ezekiel and Daniel and Esther. Those all occur in Babylon, pretty much, more or less. And then the people come out of Babylon, or at least a remnant comes out of Babylon to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the wall, rebuild the temple first, or start on rebuilding the temple and then rebuild the wall. And that's Ezra and Nehemiah. And then after that, we pretty much have no more biblical, I think I'm right, Bill, we have no more biblical historical background from that point forward, I don't think, do we? I mean, we have prophets, but we don't have clear historical information that I can think of. Can you? After Nehemiah? I can't think of any more that would come up. So the Nehemiah time period ends in the 4-ish hundreds BC, and then we have a time period there that all the way up to the time of Christ that we really don't have a lot of biblical information on. In the course of all this that's going on, we had the Assyrian Empire that took away the northern kingdom. We have the Babylonian Empire that takes away the Judean kingdom. And then the Babylonians are taken over by the Medes and then the Persians. And then Alexander the Great comes through in 330 BC, takes over again. And then some 100, 200 or so, I can't remember when did the Roman Empire come into being? 50, 100 AD, BC, something like that. I can't remember the exact date. But anyway, the Roman Empire comes in after that. So we have all these empires coming through. And the Jews in every case are subservient to these empires. So I wanted to take a glance at especially Daniel and Ezekiel. And one has to ask the question, which one of those comes first? Ezekiel comes first in the list of the books in the Bible. But it turns out that if you look at it kind of carefully, Daniel seems to actually occur first. Now, Daniel spans 50, 60 years of time, but he comes in just a little bit earlier than Ezekiel, if I can get this to come up. If you go to Daniel 1, he says that he, in fact, the first few words, he says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, which was one of the last few kings of Judah, you may recall, who was a servant of Nebuchadnezzar. He was a vassal of his. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And Jehovah delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king orders one of his, I guess it'd be his chief of staff, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, blah, 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 to be trained. This is describing the first carrying off that Nebuchadnezzar did. If you go and look in 2 Kings chapters 24, 25-ish, and that sort of things, you'll see that he didn't actually carry everybody off. He just kind of took some of the choice people away. And Daniel is one of those people that gets taken away in the early first carrying away of a few people. He had not yet really devastated Judah at this point. Nebuchadnezzar had not. So Daniel is early. If you go over and look in Ezekiel, he says that he was doing things in the reign of Jehoiachin, the next king. So Ezekiel comes a little later than Daniel. But Daniel spans some 50 or 60 years, and Ezekiel is contained within that 50 or 60 years. So they're actually contemporaries within just a few years of each other. In fact, Ezekiel mentions Daniel by name 3 times, referring, kind of offhandedly referring to him as a wise person. You know, are you as wise as Daniel? You know, that kind of thing. So Ezekiel mentions Daniel as if everybody knows who that is when Ezekiel's talking. Yes, dear.
Was deported to Babylon at the age of 16. I don't remember.
Wonder how they know that.
I don't know. I wonder.
Well, they said young men. And by the age of 16, you were grown in those days. I mean, you know, women were having children by that time because they didn't live to be 30. They had to have them early. But anyway, they were young, whatever they were. So we have the Daniel writings occurring more or less first, but spanning much longer than Ezekiel does. And then Esther comes even later than those two. In fact, Esther comes pretty much, if I'm not mistaken, she comes pretty much after the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the wall and the temple. So she's part of the people who stayed in Babylon and didn't come back. So anyway, for that reason, it's my intent to cover Daniel first, since he appears to come first. There is a lot of, what shall we call it, argument, I'll say, over exactly when Daniel was written. Many scholars claim that Daniel must have been written in about BC 164 instead of BC 500. And their argument is kind of interesting. They say he's too accurate. That's an interesting argument, isn't it? He's too accurate in his prophecies. And so they say he must have written it shortly after most of this occurs because he's just way too accurate in his prophecies. And as we go, you'll see some of them are super accurate. And they're almost scary accurate. But there's a problem with that in that since Ezekiel mentions him 3 times, and there is not a significant, at least I couldn't find anything significant that questioned the date of Ezekiel, then the guy must have been known in the 500 BC time frame. So there's a problem with that because Ezekiel was written in the 500 time frame. So anyway, Jesus himself quotes Daniel, by the way, in Matthew 24. I think that's the only reference to Daniel in the New Testament. And the people are asking when things are going to happen. And he is warning them basically of the fall of Jerusalem at about AD 70. Yes?
Oftentimes we think of young Daniel being thrown into the lion's den, but he would have had to been close to 70.
Yeah, and when we get to that, we should talk about that in some detail, but continue.
That may have been the reason why the lions didn't eat that old man.
Yeah, they was too old and tough. That would be my hope. Don't eat me, I'm too old and tough. You wouldn't like it. Just go ahead and eat something else. So where was I? Jesus. He makes reference to Daniel, and most scholars, when they talk about, Daniel mentions the abomination that brings desolation toward the end of his little short 12-chapter book. And most people assign that to, what's his name? Antiochus Epiphanes, I believe is his name, who in about AD 164-ish sets up an altar to a pagan god in the temple, and I believe sacrificed pigs on it and did various things, which was extremely obnoxious to the Jews. And these scholars say that was the abomination that brings desolation. Jesus uses that same reference in Matthew 24 to refer to a future time of past him, which AD BC 164 had already occurred, 164, nearly 200 years before, at the time he's speaking. And he says, when you see the abomination that brings desolation, run for the hills. And he's referring to the fall of Jerusalem. And I don't remember what the exact thing was that happened that one could assign to that. Titus, yeah. Tore everything down. And there's so much history, it's almost impossible to really get it all together in one pile and understand it. The more I study, the deeper it gets, and I just get lost. So I thank you for having done that for me. But anyway, he says, when you... Go ahead.
Backstory on that is that Titus was going down to invade Egypt, and the emperor in Rome said, no, you can't. I made it bad, so he back and destroyed Jerusalem.
So he just got mad and says, I'll just tear up Jerusalem. I love that. Anyway, so he says, when you see this thing that's predicted by Daniel, and it's unclear if Daniel is predicting two events or if he was only predicting one event or what, but prophecy quite often, as Peter mentions, is not subject to private interpretation and can have multiple meanings on down through things. So anyway, Jesus makes reference to Daniel, says, when you see this, run for the hills because bad things are about to happen. And indeed, many of the Christians spotted it in time and left Jerusalem. So that was kind of fortunate in that case. So that sets the stage, I guess, a little bit. The king that is doing things when Daniel starts writing is Nebuchadnezzar, which is one of the names that we know. And he also deals with some other kings on down the line because Nebuchadnezzar doesn't span Daniel's entire life, but Daniel spans numerous kings' lives. And so, as we begin, Daniel is in Babylon. There's still mostly people back in Jerusalem under Jehoiakim, who is kind of a puppet king. There are going to be at least two more carryings away over a few years here, but Daniel is already in Babylon effectively as a hostage. I mean, they would take prominent people as hostages and hope that the kings and stuff back in the other place wouldn't do stupid stuff. But that's essentially what it is. So in verse 3, the king asks his chief of staff to go out and find some of these really smart, good-looking, intelligent, well-informed, quick learners to serve in the king's palace. And he was supposed to teach them the Babylonian language and the history and literature of the Babylonians so that they would be knowledgeable in that regard in verse 4. He assigns them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they're trained for 3 years. So basically they're getting a bachelor's degree in Babylonian language and history is what they're getting. They're being trained to serve in the king's court. You should always be looking for smart people to work for you. This was a smart guy. In business, I learned very early when I was at Duke Power Company, my number one goal as a young department leader was to find and train my replacement as quickly as possible and surround myself with people smarter than me if I could. Smarter than me. You know, some management people are intimidated by that. They want to be the smartest one in the house. No, I may be in charge, but I want the smartest people I can get working for me. One of the guys that I hired shortly before I left Duke Power had a master's degree in physics, knew nothing about radiation protection. And the first day he came to work for me, I said, I can't remember his name now. I said, what are you thinking you might like to do? He says, well, I'd like to become a certified health physicist as soon as possible. And I went, ha, 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 ha. You don't even have a degree in health physics. You don't have any experience in health physics. I've just brought you kind of in as an intern. He is today a certified health physicist, and he has who was my boss's job. He is in charge of all of health physics for all of Duke Power Company. He is the system-wide health physicist for the corporation. I didn't have that job. I was one step under that. Smart guy, though. That was the reason I hired him. You should hire smart people. You should surround yourself with smart people. You should associate with smart people. Now, that doesn't mean you discriminate against people who are not so smart, because sometimes what you think isn't smart is smarter than you think it is. There are some people out there with no college degrees that are way smart, okay? Especially if they got some age on them. And we need to bring back this idea that older people have more experience than younger people, and a 20-something is not more experienced than a 60-something. I don't care how much they've lived or they think they've lived. It's hard sometimes to put up with what the 20-somethings think they know and think we don't know. You're just an old person. You don't know anything. No, we've learned a few things. You don't even have to be all that smart, an old person, to be smarter than the young ones in the ways of life. But anyway, the king here is surrounding himself. These are not Babylonians, but he has brought them in. He's going to make them part of his court. They're smart. They can figure out how to do things. And these are young people, so they're going to have some limits and everything. But he's tutoring them and bringing them up to be part of his court. And it says in verse 6, among those who were chosen were some from Judah. And the first name we see there is Daniel, and then we see three more names, Hananiah, Mishael, I guess it's Mishael, and Azariah. They get new names. They name Daniel Belteshazzar, and I didn't look up the meanings of these. And then you hear the other three names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which we've all heard as children. When I was growing up, the way we remembered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was it was Sadsack, Meshach, and to bed we go. And then I got to where I couldn't think of anything but that, so I had to quit that. But anyway, so these are three famous names that we know. Daniel, the writer of the book, and Daniel in the lion's den, and all these other things. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and I almost said to bed we go, Abednego. Why are they famous? The fiery furnace. They were thrown into the fiery furnace, which is in Daniel, and which we'll talk about. But they were among the smart, good-looking, wise people that he was training. So it says, we have the story here, and most of us have heard this at one time or another, beginning in verse 8. Daniel says, don't feed us the king's food. I think King James Version says the king's dainties. Don't feed us that, just feed us, and the NIV, I think, says vegetables, and the King James says pulse, which I believe is vegetables. But he says, feed us that instead of what the king's table feeds us as. Probably the king's table was full of all kinds of sweets and donuts and all the good stuff that you eat in this world. All the sweet, good, tasty stuff. Of course, they didn't really have cane sugar, so they ate a lot of dates and stuff like that. But it just wasn't good for you. So Daniel says, feed us vegetables for a while. And the guy that's running the show says, I can't do that. The king will kill me if I don't follow his rules. And so Daniel says, I'll tell you what, let's run a test. Feed us this for 10 days, and let's see how it goes. And so he says, okay, I can do that. So he feeds them vegetables, basically, for 10 days while everybody else eats the other stuff. And at the end of 10 days, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, at least, look better and healthier than the guys who are eating at the king's table, because they're only drinking water and eating vegetables. The other guys are overeating on the donuts and the hamburgers and the pizza and drinking way too much wine, which is just not good for you. Well, the pizza isn't, but all the other is. But you can't eat that stuff continuously and be healthy, you see. So they look healthier than the other guys do, and so the guy that's training them agrees to let that keep going. Let's see. I got too far down the story. Okay, down to verse 17. Verse 16, it says they ate vegetables. Verse 17, it says, to these 4 young men, the 4 we just mentioned, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand, just Daniel, could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king, which would be 3 years, to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talks to them, finds Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have the other names too, finds them to be really impressive. And so they go into the king's service. And it says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And it says, Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus, which is quite some time later. Looks like King Cyrus comes in about 539. So but it looks like Daniel may have even gone a little bit further than that, because he makes some mention of Darius, who comes even later than that. So anyway, chapter 2 begins one of the famous stories in Daniel about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Nebuchadnezzar has this really scary dream that bothers him a great deal. He calls in all of his astrologers and magicians and everything, and he says, tell me the meaning of the dream. Nebuchadnezzar's kind of smart and devious at the same time. The astrologers go, great, king, what was the dream? And he says, well, you're so smart, you tell me what I dreamed. It's kind of like the psychic that went out of business. Shouldn't she have seen that coming? He says, I had a dream. Tell me what it means. And they go, great, tell us what you dreamed. He says, no, you tell me what I dreamed, and then you tell me what it means. And they go, nobody can do that. And he says, well, you're going to have to do it, or I'm going to put you to death. I'm going to just have you hacked up into pieces if you can't tell me what I dreamed and what it meant. So he sets out an order to kill all of the wise people, because he's so mad. That's pretty stupid, but he decides he's going to kill all the wise people. So apparently they begin the process, and they come to Daniel. And Daniel goes in, and I can't remember if he goes in and talks to the king first or not, but basically Daniel prays to God, has a dream of his own, and then he goes before the king and said, you need to quit killing the guys. I can tell you the story. I can tell you what's going on. So stop killing all the wise people. So Daniel says, all right, I'm going to tell you what you dreamed without you telling me. And then I'm going to tell you what it means. Verse 8, when the king is talking to his servants, he says, I'm certain you're trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I'm firmly decided. If you don't tell me the dream, there's only one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. So they have a heart attack. So the king brings in Daniel. Daniel, in verse 20 through 23, knows the dream and is singing a song or a psalm of praise to God. And in verse 24, Daniel goes in and he talks to the guy, I can't pronounce his name, Arioch or something like that, verse 24, whom the king had appointed to execute all the wise men, and says, don't execute the wise men, take me to the king, I will interpret the dream for him. So the guy that was going to execute everybody goes and tells the king about Daniel. Daniel, let me make sure, I think I've gotten ahead of myself. He tells him he needs to have some time. Okay, verse 29. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, in other words, the future. And the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. So he says, you looked, verse 31, and there was a great big statue. Huge, dazzling, awesome. The head of the statue was made of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. It's just dust that blows away. Have you ever seen anybody thresh wheat? After they break it off the stems, they take it and they would throw it up in the air. And the chaff is very light and dusty, and the wheat is heavy. So the wheat falls back down to the threshing floor and the chaff blows away. I've actually used this in some other processes. I would throw it up in the air and let the dust blow out of it and let the good stuff fall to the ground if I was trying to sift through some of my model train gravel or something to get it to a certain size. So he says, let's see. Okay, the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. And the king goes, holy cow, that's what I dreamed. So, your majesty, you are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. And boy, he just really lays it on. You are the head of gold. So the Babylonian Empire is the gold head. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. That would be the silver kingdom. I don't know if, I'm trying to remember if that's, I think it's the Medes, right? Then the third kingdom, one of bronze, I guess that's the Persians. A fourth kingdom, strong as iron, that would be the Alexander's Grecian kingdom. It says, for iron breaks and smashes everything. As iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. And indeed, Alexander's kingdom did that. Just as you saw that the feet and toes are partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, which is the, I'm interpreting that to be the kingdom that immediately followed Alexander, which would be the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and two more, I can't remember the names, his four generals that took over and split up his kingdom into four pieces. It could be a reference to the Roman Empire. Yes? Yeah, okay. All right, so let's back up. The gold head is the Babylonian Empire. The silver body is the Medo-Persian, since they're not usually separated. The third one, the legs, would be Alexander. Interestingly, I believe that one was bronze, was it? Alexander's had all of his weapons were bronze, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, the Bronze Age would be, the Bronze Empire would be Alexander's empire, and then the Roman Empire would be the iron and clay, which did get split up into lots of different pieces at times. We actually have the split of the Roman Empire between the East and the West Kingdom. But anyway, they don't know what that means, but that's basically what we see as the answer. He's predicting future kingdoms. And let's see, in the time of those kings, talking about the iron and clay mixed kingdom, in the time of those kings, verse 44, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Now, what was the rock that grew to the size of a mountain and was not made by human hands? What could that possibly be? And it created an eternal kingdom. It's Christ and the church. I mean, it is so clear when we look back and see that. Even if he wrote this in BC 164, how did he know that was coming? If he were not. Or even if it were written in 164 BC, how in the world could that have been known? That this eternal kingdom from God was coming into being. And, they said, well, the church really doesn't. Well, yeah, it does too. It pretty much transcends all kingdoms. The church has managed to survive every empire that's come and gone for 2,000 years, despite concerted attempts to destroy it. In fact, the more people tried to destroy the church, the faster it grew. In fact, when Constantine legitimized the church, what was it, 325? Okay. In 325 BC, when he legitimized the church, that was the worst thing that ever happened to the church, in my opinion. Because the quality of the church went down, down, down. It became fashionable to be a Christian. It became politically correct to be a Christian. It became business advantageous to be a Christian. And so everybody joined, presumably joined. They were in it because it made sense to do it. So the commitment went down. When they were trying to destroy the church, you weren't a Christian unless you really, really meant to do it, because your life was on the line. We don't experience that much nowadays, in this country certainly, but there are people who become Christians while here, and I've heard of some of them, they would say, I'm going back home. And people would say, oh, I trust that's a good thing. You're going to go see your family and visit for a while. No, I'll probably be killed when I go back home, because my family is not Christian and they will not tolerate Christians. That's commitment. I don't think I'd go back home. I think I'd stay here. But the church seems to grow more in times of trouble and strife than it does in times of favor. This is why when I mentioned to you several weeks ago about the presidential election, I said, vote your conscience, who you think would make the best president. But pray for the leaders that will advance the kingdom of God. And that may not be any of the leaders that we want. That could even be some other country conquering the United States and, persecuting the church. But don't we want the borders of the kingdom to expand at all costs to us? That's hard, isn't it? If it would, can you say, if it would advance the borders of God's kingdom, I would be glad to die? That's hard.
I'm trying to teach my children that there's nothing more important in life than being a Christian.
That's right.
And whatever job you take, whether, we look down on people that have menial jobs.
I don't.
And things like that. But I don't care what kind of job you have. If you do it as a Christian, then you'll be fine.
I've also said in the past, and give me a second to get through it because it sounds terrible. I do not care. I care, but ultimately I do not care if my children and grandchildren starve to death, as long as they make it. Yes, Lord? Woo! That was exciting. I don't care if they starve to death. as long as they make it to heaven. I don't care. I mean, I would rather they didn't, but ultimately I don't care. I don't care if my children and grandchildren are slaughtered tomorrow, as long as they make it to heaven. That's hard, isn't it? But this is where our minds need to go. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't care about the physical world, we shouldn't care about our own families, and we shouldn't care about other people. But ultimately, when you get right down to it, the only thing that matters is whether or not you make it to the presence of God. That's the only thing that matters. And the only thing you should care about for other people is whether or not they get to the presence of God. That's all that matters, ultimately. Because this is just a quick wisp of wind and it's over with. And I'm sorry that sounds so hard, but that's just the way the real thing is. This is one of the reasons that understanding Christianity is very, very difficult for some people, because it's hard to explain something so ethereal as eternal life. I mean, that's hard to, even those of us who are members of the church and have been Christians for a long time, we still don't understand what that really means. You know, every time I start thinking about it, I get a headache. It makes my head hurt if I try to think about eternity and what I would do in eternity and how that would be. And whoa, you know, my head just starts spinning. This is part of what faith does for us. So, the king, he says, the dream is true in verse 45, and the interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar, who had just been told what his dream was and had told no one what it was, so Daniel is telling him his thoughts, even though no one had been told what his thoughts were. It says in verse 46, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and order. This could have been interpreted very easily as, then King Nebuchadnezzar worshiped before Daniel. Not as a god, but giving him honor, and he ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon, which would be the capital city, and placed him in charge of all of its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed, Daniel's smart, he's going to get his buddies in on this. Daniel asked him to appoint Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as administrators over the province of Babylon. In other words, they worked for Daniel under him, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. And we have reached, what time is it? Is it 10:15 yet? It's 10:15. So we will stop there. And the next thing that will come up is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And your assignment for next week is to figure out who the fourth person was in the fiery furnace with them. And come prepared to tell me who that was so that I will know. I do not know who that was. But we'll talk about it and discuss who it might be, and we'll see how that goes for next week. Okay. Blessing. May your life bring glory and honor to God, and may your death bring even more glory and honor to God. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.